and welcome to Afternoon Briefing here on ABC News. I'm Patricia Karvelas. Coming up, Deputy Chief Medical Officer Michael Kidd. Shadow Foreign Minister Penny Wong joins me too, plus my political panel. But here are our top stories that we're following today. Cautious relaxation of restrictions in Victoria as some students return to classrooms across the rest of the country for their first face-to-face lessons. The government faces a double deficit due to the economic effects of coronavirus, the largest in Australia's history. I'll be speaking to Deloitte Access Economics partner Nikki Hutley later in the show. Canberra given 10 days to explain why China shouldn't impose tariffs on Australian-grown barley as the Prime Minister plays down trade tensions. Agriculture Minister David Littleproud will join me shortly. Coronavirus restrictions are being eased across Australia this week. Each state and territory is approaching the undertaking differently, though. Here's where restrictions stand across the country right now. In Victoria, people will be allowed to have 5 guests in their home from midnight tomorrow, and groups of up to 10 will be allowed to take part in outdoor activities. From Friday, outdoor gatherings of up to 10 people will be allowed in New South Wales, and you'll be able to host 5 people at your home at any one time. In Tasmania, up to 20 people can now attend funerals. Aged care residents can have visitors, but only once a week, with a maximum of 2 guests. And national parks are open to locals for exercise. In Western Australia, cafes and restaurants will be open for up to 20 patrons, subject to physical distancing from next week. Libraries will reopen and people will be able to move more freely within the state. And the Northern Territory has one of the more ambitious plans, aiming to have all businesses open again by early June. And from this Friday, pubs, gyms and churches will reopen. For more on this, I'm joined now by the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Professor Michael Kidd. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Patricia.
The relaxation of restrictions relies heavily on personal responsibility. How confident are you that people will follow the rules in private properties?
Well, I think what we've seen over the last number of weeks while the restrictions have been in place, most people right across Australia have behaved magnificently and have followed the restrictions, have followed the rules, have been incredibly diligent. And what we're hoping is that will continue. Now is not the time for anyone to become complacent. The lifting of restrictions which we're seeing are a very cautious first step, and we're only seeing the easing of some of the restrictions, and as you've described, that's happening in a different approach with each of the states and territories. So very important that people are adhering to the restrictions in their own state or territory and making sure that they're following the rules and doing everything they can to protect their own health, to protect the health of their family, to protect the health of the wider community.
This health advice was provided to the National Cabinet about easing restrictions in this 3-stage plan. Give us an indication of what the Prime Minister means when he says we're going to see more spikes, more outbreaks potentially, that people have to learn how to live with this virus. What did you tell the Prime Minister and the Premiers and Chief Ministers about that kind of increase? You must have modelled it. What should we expect?
So for this, we need to go back 4 weeks when the Prime Minister announced that we were moving towards this announcement about a stepped approach. And what he said at that time was that we would be doing increased testing, we would be doing increased contact tracing, so tracing or following up with any contacts of anyone who's diagnosed with COVID-19, and also increasing our capacity when we do get outbreaks to be able to act very swiftly, to isolate and quarantine people and to arrange testing to see who's been infected and who needs to be in further quarantine and for what period before things can start opening up again. So that has been happening over the last number of weeks. We've seen a number of outbreaks which have occurred, and obviously we would like moving forward not to have those sorts of outbreaks, but it is quite possible that we'll continue to see a small number of outbreaks occurring in different parts of the country, but we have the capacity to act very quickly. What we all need to be doing, though, is doing all we can to prevent those outbreaks. And the most important message is that if people experience a fever or if people start to develop the symptoms of a respiratory tract infection, no matter how mild those symptoms, stay at home, don't go to work, don't go to school, don't go to the shops, contact your GP and arrange to get tested.
Professor
In this way,
Kidd,
we're all contributing towards making sure we don't get these outbreaks.
Professor Kidd, in terms of the numbers though, you must have figured out what the health outcome would be of easing some of the restrictions. If you've worked towards this number, 5 people visiting a home, for instance, what's the number that you anticipate about the increase in the number of coronavirus cases we might face?
So we're not predicting or speculating on what possible numbers we might get. What
is there
we're
a reason
at
for that?
Is
Why
how
not?
do we prevent going... Well, because that's a very imprecise science, Patricia. It's like trying to forecast what is happening. What we know from the modelling is what would have happened if we hadn't have implemented the restrictions that we had put in place. And what we're looking at now is very cautious steps, and each of those steps needs to be given time to see what the response is, to see if we do see significant increases in the number of new infections. And you've got to remember, at the moment we have less than 20 infections being diagnosed right across the country each day. So Australia is in a very good position at the moment, and we want to keep it that way. But we're not moving towards being able to eliminate the virus from Australia. We're suppressing the virus and recognising that we may still get a small number of new infections each day, and doing all we can to make sure that doesn't increase dramatically.
The flu season is upon us. If there was a really bad outbreak, do we have the hospital capacity now to deal with that and what might be sort of random spikes of COVID-19?
Yes, so the flu season usually commences in June or July each year, and the difference with influenza compared to COVID-19, of course, is that we have a highly effective vaccine, and we can prevent an outbreak or a significant outbreak of influenza occurring in Australia this year by everybody, and particularly the most vulnerable people, going and getting their flu shot if they haven't done so already. Already many millions of people have had their flu shot for this year. We need to make sure as many people as possible do that, and so prevent the likelihood of having a significant influenza outbreak. We do not want to have the possibility of having both an outbreak of influenza and any increase in the number of people with COVID-19 occurring at the same time, because if that did happen, and if it did happen in large numbers, then that would put a very significant strain on our hospital systems, on our intensive care units. All the work that we've been doing has been to prevent that increased strain from occurring through flattening the curve.
We've had mass testing across the country. What's the scope for false negatives? How much faith can we have in that data?
Yes, so the test is a very efficient test, but like nearly all tests which we have in medicine and in healthcare, there are occasional times when a test will be false negative. And with COVID-19, this can occur for a couple of reasons. It may be that someone has just been infected and is not yet producing enough of the virus for the test to be able to pick it up and produce a positive result. It may be that a test has not been carried out in a way that has managed to pick up any of the virus. And as we know, when these tests are being done, you have to put the swab a long way into the nasal passages and into the throat in order to get an adequate specimen. The important thing, though, is if somebody has symptoms and their treating doctor thinks that they may have COVID-19 and they actually get a negative result, very often what the doctor is doing is saying, let's repeat the test and just be 100% sure, just in case that was a falsely negative test.
The Victorian Chief Health Officer said in a press conference that essentially it's up to people to make their own determinations about whether they would give family and friends a hug or a handshake if they saw them, as we change some of these restrictions, allow people to come into homes. Would that be the same advice you'd give?
So I think this is advice for each individual and for each individual's circumstance. So I'm particularly concerned about people who are vulnerable and at increased risk if they were to contract COVID-19. And this is particularly elderly people, people aged over 70, people over 65 with chronic health problems, people who are immune compromised, people who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders over 50 with one or more chronic conditions. These people, I think we should be maintaining maintaining our physical distancing if these are our loved ones, and protecting them by not coming in and giving hugs and breaching that physical barrier at this time. We have to make sure that we're doing all we can to protect the people who are most vulnerable in our society. And similarly, those people who are vulnerable at the moment should still be staying in their homes and only going out to go shopping or to go to their medical appointments, not going out for excursions or walks in the park and so forth. These are the people that we must be protecting still in our society.
So you're saying, you know, if I can sort of analyse what you're saying, don't hug older people, be very careful about hugging older people, but make your own decisions in other age cohorts?
Well, I think for other age cohorts, the recommendation is still there about maintaining the 1.5 metres. Clearly, people in your own household, you can hug as much as you wish. But I think we've got to be very cautious. And this first step that we've got is a cautious step. And so I would tell people to please exercise caution at this time.
What would you do?
What am I doing?
Yeah.
So I did not have the opportunity yesterday to hug my elderly mum because I don't want to put her at risk, even on Mother's Day, of COVID-19.
Okay, so that's the decision for an elderly mum. I understand that. But if you were to invite 5 people over for dinner, a handshake's okay? I mean, I know this sounds like a trivial question, but it kind of isn't now that we've learnt so much more and become amateur epidemiologists as we've made the joke. We're not, many of us, professionally trained, but we are cautious about that now. Should we continue to be?
Yes, we should still continue to be cautious. We should still be very careful with our hand hygiene. I don't think we should, at this time, be reaching out and doing handshakes or hugs with people who we're not sharing our homes with. The advice about inviting people into your home is to maintain the physical distancing measures, which we've had in place for when we're outside of our homes, making sure that after people have been visiting our homes, again, that we wash our hands, that we clean the surfaces. We've got to be protecting each other at this time as we start to move very cautiously out of the restrictions.
Just quickly before I let you go, because there have been reports that Wuhan, where of course this outbreak happened first, there are 17 new cases of coronavirus reported in the last 24 hours. How alarmed should we be by those reports?
Well, I think that what we're doing is watching and seeing what happens in each country. And we've seen some countries which lifted their restrictions and then have had to impose some restrictions back in again. We've seen this happen in Singapore. We've seen this happen in Japan. We're not yet clear what's going to happen in China or in Wuhan. As the Prime Minister said on Friday, the virus is still with us here in Australia. There's no reason to think why the virus wouldn't still be in other countries, and clearly I expect that what we'll see happen in other countries where outbreaks start to occur is that measures are put back in place to make sure that the public is being protected. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Kidd. Thanks for the opportunity. That's the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Professor Michael Kidd. Prime Minister Scott Morrison has dismissed suggestions his government is considering winding back its $130 billion JobKeeper program. It's estimated up to 1 million people have lost their jobs due to the pandemic.
How that program can be adjusted to better support over that period, or if there are sectors that come under greater strain over a longer period of time. These are all things that the government is fully aware of. But we are not going to get ahead of ourselves here. And I would encourage others not to get ahead of themselves here. We are 6 weeks into a 6-month program in one of the most uncertain economic and health environments any of us have ever seen. And so if you've got a crystal ball, you might want to share it with me. I don't have one. So we're going to make decisions based on the advice that we have and our read of the economy. But right now, Australians need that support.
Labor leader Anthony Albanese has urged his political opponents to use the once-in-a-generation opportunity the coronavirus crisis presents to reshape Australia's economy. Addressing his caucus colleagues in Canberra, Mr Albanese has pushed for the decentralisation of government agencies, the revitalisation of the manufacturing industry and a boost to infrastructure investment, including high-speed rail. He's also warned against a return to what he's described as the coalition's traditional agenda of cutting services, suppressing wages and undermining job security.
This experience has reminded us that there is indeed such a thing as society, that we are all connected, and the strength of this bond is what is pulling us through as Australians. Our challenge must be to recover and to recover stronger, not just to return to as we were. Let's not snap back to insecure work, to job seekers stuck in poverty, to scientists being ignored. We must move forward to having not just survived the pandemic, but having learned from it. This is a once-in-a-political-lifetime event, and it creates a once-in-a-century opportunity to renew and revitalise the Federation, a once-in-a-generation chance to reshape our economy so it works for people and deepens the meaning of the fair go.
I'm joined now by Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Penny Wong. Senator, welcome.
Good to be with you, Patricia.
Before we get to Anthony Albanese's latest vision statement, the government is contemplating changes to the JobKeeper scheme to better target it. What sort of changes would Labor be open to?
Well, we've been saying for some time that the government should look to include the million casual workers who are excluded from JobKeeper. But look, I think the important point about the Prime Minister's answers today is this. He gave that answer in response to a question generated by a press from various Liberal backbenchers to tighten up on JobKeeper, to snap back. And this really does demonstrate that when Scott Morrison and the Liberals talk about snapping back, they mean snap back to the old Liberal values, the old Liberal DNA, which is cutting services and cutting support. Anyone who's been out in the Australian community at this time knows how important this wage subsidy, which Labor fought for and Labor argued for, is to so many Australian families.
So is partisanship and big old politics back then? I mean, when you say snap back to Liberal ideology, it sounds like the sort of ceasefire on politics is over.
Look, I think there are very different sets of values on display in politics in Australia. And it has been good to see the coalition government embracing economic stimulus. It shouldn't have taken this for them to do that. It's certainly been good to see the Prime Minister saying we should be in this together. But the reality is we all know when he says snapback, he means walking away from those things. That's what he means. He means snapping back to Liberal values.
No, but hang on a minute.
Anthony Albanese.
Let's be clear. He talks about snapping back to the economy as it was before the coronavirus. If that were to work, and, you know, of course, that's hypothetical at this stage, what's wrong with that? Because these are emergency measures to deal with people who've lost their jobs or need emergency help. If they don't need that help, why should they get the help?
Well, as Anthony Albanese pointed out today, we are at a very important moment in the nation's history, and we can make a choice about what sort of Australia comes out of this crisis, and we can learn the lessons of this crisis. And there are quite an important set of lessons for us to learn. One of them is we are all in this together. We're a society, not just an economy. Another is that the insecurity of employment that many Australians face causes unacceptable levels of financial and personal hardship. It is casual workers and people in the most insecure forms of employment who have borne the brunt of this crisis. Now, these and other lessons are lessons we can learn. We all want to recover. The question is, how do we recover? And we in Labor think there should be a proper discussion, a proper conversation about what are the priorities for recovery. How do we recover stronger?
Anthony Albanese has just said that it's fair enough to change the JobKeeper payment so that essentially a worker would be paid less if they were earning less than JobKeeper, so that the money gets redistributed to casuals who don't have the money. Is that reasonable?
Well, look, he pointed out in his speech one of the anomalies in the JobKeeper package is that a single mum with 3 kids who's been on in the same job for 11 months gets less than somebody who's doesn't get JobKeeper, whereas someone who's been in a part-time job for a lengthy period might in fact get more than their income. So, of course, we have been constructive all the way through this. We have looked for solutions, not arguments. And if the government comes forward with sensible changes, we'll look for good solutions. My point is, though, that the Prime Minister's response today was generated by agitation again from his Liberal backbench around this program, a program which initially the government resisted. And it really does demonstrate what the Liberals mean when they talk about snapback.
Labor leader Anthony Albanese says it shouldn't have taken a pandemic for the government to introduce free childcare and also increase the unemployment benefit. Well, are these the two things, if I can read from that you're going to campaign for to stay? Do you want free childcare to stay and the doubling of the unemployment rate to stay?
He said many things. He said it shouldn't have taken a pandemic for us to understand what the casualisation of the workforce meant. It shouldn't have taken a pandemic to understand what the collapse in Australian manufacturing under this government meant. What Anthony laid out today, I think, is a vision which talks about what sort of country we are and what sort of country we can be as we recover. He talked about what we've learnt during this pandemic and what we should build on. We've learnt the value of looking after each other. We've learnt the value of Medicare and universality of Medicare. We've also learnt the extent to which insecure work creates too much hardship for too many Australians. So we are engaging as the opposition in a dialogue with the Australian community about what our priorities should be for the recovery. And that was the vision statement that Anthony laid out today.
Okay, that's the broader context, fair enough. But on those two specific issues, do you think
Patricia,
the unemployment rate should be doubled?
Patricia, on New Start, I would say very clearly that I think we all know that having an unemployment, what was New Start, now Job Seeker, rate that was below the poverty line is unviable. And the government knows that. I mean, they wouldn't have changed it if they didn't know that. So, of course, we hope that the government recognises the lesson it itself learnt when it changed the rate of job seeker and retains it. But what I would say to you is what Anthony laid out today was what we will be doing as a Labor caucus in the coming weeks and months. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to look at what sort of nation we should be to reshape the nation for the better.
China is threatening to impose tariffs totaling more than 80% on Australian barley. How damaging would that be given producers are already struggling?
It would be extremely damaging, and what we'd say to the government is the government should be managing this relationship in the best interests of the country, and it should be managing this relationship soberly and sensibly in the best interests of our exporters. I've seen what the Trade Minister has to say about the process by which he'll go through. That is what he should be doing, and we're supportive of that. But more broadly, this is a relationship the government really does need to manage more sensibly. We need the Foreign Minister to lead it and the Prime Minister. Regrettably, too much of the China relationship is being led by backbenchers, and that is a risky thing for our bilateral relationship.
The Prime Minister isn't drawing a link between China's threats on Australian barley and their anger at our push as a nation, bipartisan push, can I say, for an investigation into the COVID-19 outbreak. But, common sense and everything. Do you think it is retaliation?
Look, I would say this. We need to manage the bilateral relationship sensibly. We have supported what we regard as an unremarkable position, which is the world wants to know how the virus began in order to ensure it doesn't happen again and in order to ensure we can manage it better. I don't think the government handled that announcement particularly well. It was an announcement made without locking in support from other nations. I don't think the government's explained its position very well. I think since the Foreign Minister announced it, she's actually only done one interview, and that's not exactly explaining these issues to Australians. I think on the China relationship and on foreign policy more generally, where we are in a very difficult and challenging phase, it is incumbent upon the Foreign Minister to lead the discussion with the Australian people, to explain Australia to the world and to explain the world to the Australian people and our place in it. Regrettably, that's not happening, and we're seeing actions from people like George Christensen and other backbenchers who are filling the space. And I think that is unhelpful to what is already at times a challenging and complex relationship, and that is our relationship with China.
Australia is threatening to take China to the World Trade Organisation. Is there any reason to think Beijing would accept a WTO decision that went against them?
Well, I'm not going to get into hypotheticals. We should continue to operate through the WTO. We have a strong history of support for that institution. We've benefited as Australians, as an exporting nation, from transparent, open and clear trading arrangements, and we should continue to utilise those mechanisms in order to try and resolve this sensibly.
A bipartisan group of US members of Congress have sent a letter to Australian Ambassador Arthur Sinodinos pledging to support Scott Morrison's push for an independent inquiry into the origins of coronavirus. Is that support welcome?
Oh, look, we support an inquiry, and any criticisms we have of how this was announced before locking in support are because, that may detract from the ultimate success of our position. And we should try and succeed in this because the world wants us to succeed. I mean, I think the world does want to know how this pandemic began, because, as I said, we want to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I would add, I think it's in all countries' interests, including China's, for that to become clear.
Coalition MP George Christensen is threatening to call the Chinese ambassador to appear before a parliamentary inquiry. Under the terms of the Vienna Convention, he doesn't. I don't think doesn't actually work that way. Was that unhelpful?
Well, this is what I was referencing before, Patricia. Like, if you have the foreign minister absent from a debate, if you have the foreign minister not leading a discussion, what you do have is backbenchers filling the space, and Mr. Christensen is the latest in a series of coalition backbenchers who've chosen to weigh in on the China relationship. I think it is risky having a backbencher do that. It would be much better if it was the foreign minister. And I have to say, I don't understand the excuses that we've seen briefed to the papers from the government, where cabinet ministers, presumably including the foreign minister, claim they didn't know about the inquiry. Well, this inquiry has been on foot since February. This is not a new idea, the idea of this inquiry. One wonders why it is that Mr. Christensen is not being spoken to by the foreign minister or other cabinet ministers about the wisdom of taking such an approach.
He wants a parliamentary inquiry into China. So does Rex Patrick, Centre Alliance Senator. Is Labor going to change its view on an inquiry into China?
No. We've taken what I think is a very responsible position about how to deal with the China relationship. We recognise it's a complex relationship. We recognise it is a relationship that is challenging to navigate. But we also recognise it is a relationship which is important to Australia. I mean, there is no area of endeavour in which, whether it's economic or in multilateralism more broadly, where China is not relevant. So engagement is important. And we think it's best that engagement be driven or be led by the government of the day and the foreign minister of the day, and we continue to urge Senator Payne to do that. I have said, and she's declined, that it would be sensible for parliamentarians to be briefed in more detail and more fully about handling the China relationship. I fear at times there's a little bit too much focus on domestic politics rather than the national interest when it comes to handling that and other issues.
Do you feel like just that key relationship is being mismanaged right now?
Look, I don't think it's in a great place, and it would benefit from consistency and discipline and leadership from the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister. It would benefit from less domestic politics and more and a longer term perspective. I mean, look, I've said previously, we need to think about the China relationship in 30-year terms, not in 3-year terms. And unfortunately, there's been a little too much from the Morrison government of a reflex to short-term domestic politics on this relationship and more broadly. And we would urge them to take a long-term position and a responsible position, and as much as possible a bipartisan position when it comes to that relationship. That's in the national interest.
Penny Wong, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
Good to speak with you.
That's the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Penny Wong. The government has revealed $449 million from the Bushfire Recovery Fund will be invested in local economic plans. National Bushfire Recovery Coordinator Andrew Colvin says the plans will be led locally by the affected communities. The Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management, David Littleproud, joins me now. David Littleproud, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Last year's bushfire season began in June. Are you working against the clock to ensure communities receive the funding that they deserve before this year's season begins again?
No, we're continuing to work on measures to make sure that when the bushfire season was actually August, September, that it started last year, and we're expecting that again, because that's the advice that our fire commissioners are telling us, that we're prepared for that, and that's why the Royal Commission will come back with its findings by then. We'll be making some further announcements about our preparedness for this bushfire season, but the recovery has been in two parts, Patricia. It's been one in the immediate relief about making sure that we give support to people in the here and now. And now this second stage is about longer term recovery, and that's about empowering local communities. We've always said we don't want a Canberra-led recovery, we want a locally led recovery that's predicated on building back better. And that's what this next phase has been, because there's a lot of healing that had to happen. People are obviously in the here and now just trying to assess their current situation, then for us to work through before they could think about longer term future. So today is about the conversations we've had with Andrew Colvin and the states, and it's got to be acknowledged that the states primarily roll out the programs that are provided by the Commonwealth. They undertake that, and it's about listening to the community and getting to the juncture where they're ready to make those decisions. And this is the next phase. The community, as we've heard, is now ready to make those decisions in a calm way with the support of all levels of government to make sure that we get this right.
Over 18,000 businesses and families still need help, Minister. What timeline can you guarantee that help will be delivered in?
So we said with the $2 billion of recovery funds, and that's in addition to what's been put out there in the short-term relief, that $1,000 per adult, and it was initially $400 per child, which we doubled to $800. Most of those actually got their money in their pocket within 40 minutes. That was the program in which the immediate disaster recovery the federal government provided. There's over $200 million that's gone out in that. But now we've said about the $2 billion as an addition around that recovery, and in fact a Senate report on a question I noticed that we provided, there's over $500 million that's been put out to date. In fact, as of the 8th of May, it was $569 million, and we said in our forward estimates that we would get to $500 million by 30th of June. So we're ahead of that. We're ahead of that because of the programs, and we've been able to work with the states who administer them to get the money out as quickly as we can, with the right precautions around it, because this is Australian taxpayers' money. There are those, unfortunately, that have tried to defraud the Australian taxpayer, so we do have to have some protocols in place. And Andrew Colvin's working with the states to make sure that happens quicker in a responsible way, and particularly things like clean-up. That's important, and we've gone for the first time saying we'll cut the cheque for half the clean-up cost with the states, and the states are now working through that as quickly as they can, and most are saying they'll have it done by August. Most will be June, which is impressive considering where we started from.
Minister, Beijing has given Canberra 10 days to explain why it shouldn't impose tariffs on Australian-grown barley. It follows an 18-month Chinese investigation into claims that Australia dumped barley into China. What do you make of the timing of China's announcement, and what will you say to convince Beijing not to impose these tariffs?
Well, this is where I think we just need to calm ourselves on this. It has been an 18-month process, and we are now at the juncture where a decision needs to be made by the Chinese. So this isn't something where they've just woken up on Saturday morning and said, let's impose this. This was coming to a crescendo, and that's what's happened, is they're now making a decision. They've made a notification that they would do that. We're trying to be as transparent and prepared to provide whatever information is required to demonstrate that Australians are good global citizens. We've we're playing by the rules. Australian farmers aren't being subsidised, let me tell you, and they'll tell you that themselves. And in fact, we live by the rules under the World Trade Organisation around anti-dumping, and we're going to continue to do that. We want to be good corporate citizens because trade's important, particularly at agriculture. We're a nation of 25 million people. We produce enough food for 75 million. So we're invested more than anybody in good trade and good trade practices, and that's why farmers want to make sure that we get a fair go and a fair deal. But we understand the concerns that Chinese officials raised 18 months ago. Industry's been working collaboratively to try and answer those questions.
So, Minister, I know you're trying to resolve them. How does this help, though? Coalition MP George Christensen, he's on your side, is threatening to call the Chinese ambassador to appear before a parliamentary inquiry. Do you support that?
No, look, I think you get passionate individuals in this place from all sides of the political aisle, and obviously that's our democratic right. That's the freedom of speech that we enjoy in this country. Now, at a government level, at an executive level, let me say that there is calm, methodical conversation happening behind the scenes, and the Foreign Minister, the Trade Minister, the Prime Minister about making sure that we calmly and methodically work through this issue, as we have for the last 18 months.
Given there are so many tensions, though, in that relationship, and obviously this tariff discussion is just part of that. Is this call by George Christensen particularly helpful at this time?
Well, that's not part of it. This is a separate. It's important for us to all understand that this is a culmination of an 18-month investigation by the Chinese, who under the rules were able to start that
My question
process.
is George Christensen's call helpful right now?
Well, let's put it in perspective. If a backbencher of any political persuasion makes statements, it's not necessarily the one in which is the government's position. And we have diplomatic channels that we continue to work through to make sure that our position is clearly articulated in a calm, methodical way. But we live in this beautiful thing called a democracy where our people can make assertions and can make statements, but in the context of our position, our foreign and diplomatic position with any other nation, it comes at the highest levels, not from backbenchers.
Should John Barilaro resign as New South Wales National Leader over the behaviour that he's shown in this contest for Eden Monaro?
Well, no, but that's a matter for the New South Wales National Party. I don't think the Federal National Party takes too kindly to other organisations telling us about who should be our leader, and therefore I won't be providing any commentary because that's the democratic right of those National Party parliamentary members of the New South Wales Parliament.
Do you agree with Barnaby Joyce that he should reconsider running in the seat of Eden Monaro?
No, look, that ship sailed. John Barilaro has already made it clear after consultation with his family that he won't be running for federal politics. In fact, he'll be leaving politics in 2023. He's focused on fire recovery delivery for New South Wales, and I think we should leave him to that, let him focus on that, because that's the most important thing. I think that those people right across New South Wales will be expecting from John Barilaro at the moment.
David Littleproud, thanks for joining us.
Anytime. Thanks, Patricia.
Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management, David Littleproud there. A quick look at the latest sports news this afternoon. Tracy Holmes joins me now. Tracy, welcome. An adapted version of Super Rugby will recommence with an Australian-only competition. What will it look like? What can we expect?
Well, Patricia, I think this is where I say I won't speak in hypotheticals, but if I did that, we wouldn't have much to talk about. So at the moment, what looks like being announced this afternoon is a return to play guidelines by the Chief Medical Officer of Rugby Australia, and they're planning on a 10-round competition with 5 teams, bringing back the Western Force, which was kicked out back in 2017. So we're yet to see who's going to fund that, who's going to broadcast that, and there's a lot still to come around the whole management and funding situation of Rugby Australia, which has been run at the moment by an interim chairman and an interim CEO. But they're trying to put the bad news to one side and announce that they will get back on the field, hopefully sometime in July.
There's confusion over whether the AFL players can resume training after Victoria eased restrictions in this announcement by the Premier today. Where is the league at on that issue?
Well, they're involved in an all-day hookup. All the commissioners are meeting in a day-long conference, and the Premier's announcement came out while they were still in that conference. So not expecting anything from the AFL until maybe a little bit later today, perhaps tomorrow. But basically, it gives the teams in Victoria the chance to go back to training in groups of 10, but still no confrontation. Still need to try and maintain distance, kicking practice, but it does ease up and free the teams to be able to start training again. The feeling from AFL is that they do want to make sure that every team in the competition, which means the teams outside Victoria as well, have the same advantages and that everybody can get onto the park under the same guidelines at the same time so that nobody has a distinct advantage over any other.
And finally, the NRL's May 28 deadline is 3 weeks away, but the game is still facing what you'd have to describe as a number of hurdles. What's happening in that space?
Look, there's a couple of hurdles, but they're all quite low, and I think they'll be easily jumped by Peter V'landys. We've seen the way he manages to make things happen in the game of NRL. But the hurdles he's looking at the moment, we still don't know about the Queensland players and the enforcement there of flu jabs. Accordingly, there are conversations that are going on at the moment, and they seem to be going well, and there is hope that there will be a positive announcement to come out of that sometime soon. There's also the referees, and of course there's some discussion there because they've decided to go back to one referee per game. That will slow the game down a little, and there are concerns that there are many around the games. This is not just the NRL, but in all of these sports that are coming back, that while the players are coming back and various officials and some of the top management, most of the staff are still wondering whether they have jobs. Remember, they're all on JobKeeper programs at the moment, and there is some discussion that once that JobKeeper program runs out, there may not be the jobs for them in the NRL that there once were.
Tracy, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Patricia.
Coronavirus restrictions are being eased across Australia this week. From midnight tomorrow, Victorians will be free to move around a little bit more, while schools have returned in modified form in New South Wales. And from Friday, gatherings of up to 10 people will be allowed outdoors, while people will be allowed 5 visitors at home. In Western Australia, cafes and restaurants will be open for up to 20 patrons, subject to physical distancing from next week. It's all pretty good fodder, really, for a conversation with my panel this afternoon. Liberal Senator Andrew Bragg and Labor MP Josh Burns. Welcome to all of you.
G'day. PK, good to be with you.
So we're kind of reopening at different paces across the country. Josh, first to you, the states and territories are relaxing now their restrictions. How worried are you about a second wave? The Prime Minister's made it quite clear we need to be prepared for outbreaks in a managed way. Is that the best way of balancing both the health priority and also the economic need of getting Australia back on track?
I think it's a really good question, PK, and I think that the approach the Victorian government's been taking of it being about focused on listening to the science, listening to the data. Over the last week in Victoria, especially my home state, Daniel Andrews has collected over 100,000 tests for people so that the slow and cautious removal of restrictions can happen. We are not out of this yet. We are at the foot of the mountain, and this thing has a long way to go. And to extract ourselves too quickly could be very, very dangerous. And while I think that the Prime Minister is right to say that the economy is hurting a lot at the moment and we should be looking at ways to rebuild the economy, this is first and foremost a health crisis, and if we extract ourselves too quickly out of this, then we are going to be facing a lot longer lockdown because the amount of infections will just rise too quickly.
OK, and to be clear, do you think we are taking ourselves out too quickly?
Well, I think that the approach from Victoria is one that Daniel Andrews announced today is the right one, where slowly and steadily, based on science, based on a huge amount of testing, based on a huge amount of data, that the Chief Health Officer and the Premier have announced that slowly you can go and visit up to 5 people. That's not to say that you don't have a risk of getting sick. That's just to say that if you do get sick, it's easier to manage and it's easier to trace. That's what this is about. It's about making sure that we do this systematically with the public health processes that have been created over the last few months. We can't rush out of this because it'll be dire if we do.
OK, Andrew Bragg, a bit of caution urged there from Josh. Should we be careful? You don't want a second spike, obviously. Yes, we'll have outbreaks, but those outbreaks can quickly turn into a significant increase, can't they?
No, I think that's all sound. New South Wales, which is the state that I represent, has the most complicated path back to normality, simply because it's Australia's global city. It's had the most infections. It's a very large landmass as well. And so I think the Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, has us to stage 1 on Friday, starting stage 1 on Friday, and no doubt that's appropriate, and they've thought through that very carefully at the state government level.
Okay, so, all right, we're going to have to wait to see really what the results of that is. There's some other spot fires going on, if you want to call them that. There's been a lot of tension in relation to the China relationship. I want to stay with you on that, Andrew Bragg. I know the government's calling for an independent inquiry supported by Labor, but clearly retaliation threatened by China. We've got this barley issue going on, which has been going on for 18 months. And then George Christensen saying that the Chinese ambassador should front a parliamentary inquiry. What's your thinking on how this relationship needs to be managed right now? I mean, how careful should Australia be given the economic implications?
It's very important that we look at each issue on its merits. Now, this barley issue is an issue to be managed by the Trade Minister, Simon Birmingham, and he's going through a process which is outlined through the World Trade Association. The broader question of the relationship, as you know, is more complicated, but at the end of the day, we will always stand up for our own sovereign interests. Our view is that there should be an independent review into the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. That is a view that is increasingly supported across the globe, and I think that's appropriate. I don't think it would be wise for any country to be cowed into not supporting an independent inquiry into something that has basically brought the world's economy to its knees for fear of any type of retaliation.
What are your thoughts on that, Josh? Obviously, Labor has backed the inquiry, but there was criticism earlier when I spoke to Penny Wong about the way the government's handling this relationship.
I think the 2 points to make is that just because George Christensen spends a lot of time overseas doesn't mean that he's an expert in foreign affairs, and that's obviously been made clear with his call on the Chinese ambassador, which is deeply unhelpful. The second point to make is this, that the Prime Minister stood in the Parliament and spoke about negative globalism and now finds himself in a position where he requires the cooperation of multilateral organisations, of the international community to be able to represent the interests of Australian businesses and Australian agriculture. We need to be working cooperatively with the international community. We need to be looking outwards as a nation. Andrew is right that we need to be asserting our own national interests, but at the same time we can't be demonising the international community. The Labor Party has always said, and Penny Wong, who was on here before, has always been a champion of the international community, multilateral organisations, and of exercising Australia's interests together in cooperation with other countries. Now, obviously, this is a very, very delicate situation and one where we need to be asserting our own national interest with China. But we need to be doing it in a way that makes sure that we have a seat at the table and we are able to have all of the cooperation we need.
Josh, I think we just turned the lights off on you.
It's a bit of a disco. It's a bit of a disco here.
There you go.
In level 2. There we go.
It's Disco Inferno there. How exciting! The Parliament, Disco Inferno.
It is. It's a bit of a strobe.
Just before I let you both go, I'm having too much fun. We've got to have fun, people. We haven't had fun in the last couple of months. Andrew Bragg, to you, JobKeeper. The government looks like it's open to making some changes. One of the changes that could be on the table, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is, clearly people who've only been working a couple of hours are able to get the full amount. Should that money instead be redistributed to casuals who weren't able to get the payment, which would see the people currently on it get basically a lower amount if they're only working a couple of hours?
Sorry, is this your idea of a fun question?
Yes, that's actually my idea of fun.
That's very good. Look, I think the whole point in responding to the pandemic is to be iterative and to be flexible. If a strong case can be made that someone has an ongoing connection to a workplace, then they should get access to the scheme. I don't think that's particularly complicated. But the beauty of this scheme is that it's been flexible, it's been able to fit across the economy, and it hasn't been terribly complicated. So I think it's been a very well designed scheme.
Josh, is that Labor's view now? Anthony Albanese has said this afternoon it would be common sense for the JobKeeper scheme to be altered so that business could pay a worker what they regularly earned, and essentially that people could lose money from that. It would allow redistribution, if you like. Is that a sensible way to move forward?
I think that the Labor Party's had a very clear message since the very beginning of this wage subsidy or this JobKeeper policy, is that it should be there to support people during this pandemic. And to be frank, the government has chosen to leave a lot of people off this JobKeeper. The biggest and most obvious examples are obviously casual workers and insecure workers. That's been where the most dramatic change, where the Labor Party has been calling for. And the industry that's been really affected by it have been hospitality as well as the arts industry as well. There have been people who Scott Morrison has chosen to leave off the JobKeeper. We need to be making sure that those people have access to it. The good example being run today by Tony Burke has been that a mother with 3 kids who's been working in casual employment, who's already got things hard enough, is not eligible for JobKeeper, but a uni student who's been working part-time is getting a massive pay increase. We can do better than that. We can have a sensible conversation about how we can be supporting people, and we can be making sure that we support people who are already in casual and insecure work during this period.
Andrew Bragg, we all know that you love talking about superannuation, and the government's scheme for people to be able to get 10 grand hasn't really gone according to plan, with, of course, that scheme being, abused. Now, Michael Sukkar, who's the minister, says that the processing of applications has resumed today. But are you confident that it will work?
I don't understand what you mean by it hasn't gone as well as we'd hoped. I mean,
not the take-up of it, but the fact that it was abused and the government had to suspend it, I mean, that's obviously not gone very well. You'd have to agree with that.
I think you'd find this has been one of the most successful and most popular schemes. I think over 1.2 million people have used it, accessing $10 billion of their own money, which has occurred in the teeth of the industry, often acting in its own narrow self-interest, not in the interests of the community.
No.
Now, there's been a very small, on the fringes, illegal
criminal activity.
Yeah, which an illegal early release of super has always been a problem, and it's been effectively an immaterial component of this hugely successful scheme, which has enabled people to get through this pandemic. I mean, after all, it is their money. I mean, every time you hear a Labor MP talk about it, you hear them run the lines from the superannuation industry. It really is getting tired.
OK, but I don't know if it's immaterial to the people who've been the victims of this illegal activity.
Well, I think all the funds will be refunding people who've been defrauded, and there's an AFP investigation into it. So it's not going to be swept under the carpet.
I'll give you the final word, Josh, on that.
I appreciate that, PK. Just because people are experiencing economic downturn and are looking to be able to access money during this really difficult period doesn't mean that this program has been a success. If you're 29 and you take out $20,000 from your superannuation, it means you're going to have roughly $100,000 less in retirement.
That is wrong.
Now, just because Andrew has an infatuation with people extracting money out of their own superannuation early, doesn't mean that that's necessarily a good idea in the long term, and it doesn't mean that it's in the interests of Australians in the long term. OK, I've got to go back to you, Andrew. An infatuation, very strong language here. You would fit into my homeschooling, lessons about really strong language, over-egged perhaps. An infatuation. Is your infatuation...
It is a nest egg, after all.
Wait, I've got a very specific question on your infatuation. Yes.
Yes.
Would you like it to increase above 10,000? Now you say it's really popular. How should this scheme be changed?
Look, I think it's a good idea to have access regimes like this on a more permanent basis. There's already been an early access regime, and I think we should look at that in the wake of many of the other changes that we should also look at making permanent, whether it be allowing people to attest a signature on a video conference, or do Medicare over the phone. I mean, all these sort of things which have been forced into doing, many of them we should make permanent.
All right. I have to stay with you just to find out. So you want to make the super scheme permanent? What else do you want to make permanent?
I think we should definitely look at that. I think there's a whole range of digital things which we should be permitting. As I said, whether it's the Medicare telehealth or whether it's allowing the signatures to be taken through a video conference. We should definitely be trying to digitise and make easy all of these things that, frankly, should have been done a long time ago.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, PK.
Liberal Senator Andrew Bragg and Labor MP Josh Burns. New forecasts predict the coronavirus crisis will deliver a twin deficit of more than $130 billion, the largest budget deficit in Australian history. The latest budget monitor from Deloitte Access Economics also forecasts Australia's unemployment hangover will last until 2024. I'm joined now by Deloitte Access Economics partner Nikki Hutley. Nikki, welcome.
Thank you, Patricia.
Are you worried about the government's rush to snap back?
I'm deeply concerned about that, to be honest. I think, we know that even though this is quite unlike anything we've had in our past history, but we do know that, as my colleague Chris Richardson always says, unemployment goes up in the elevator and comes down by the stairs. We know that this is not something that we are going to snap back from, and we will need ongoing support. The government's own modelling says we will have, very high unemployment by the September quarters, where it peaks at, 1.7 million unemployed. So if you're going to pull the rug out from under those people, it's going to have a very large impact. If you suddenly not only take away JobKeeper, but halve JobSeeker, that's going to really hit household incomes and obviously the economy itself. It would be a double whammy, a second wave for the economy, if you like.
So how about this idea that's now being canvassed, Labor backing it, of changing the JobKeeper so that some people do lose money if they were already earning less, but it's redistributed to more people?
Yeah, look, there's a lot to be said for maybe having the two things, JobSeeker and JobKeeper aligned and potentially spreading it out to fill in those gaps. But I think we've just got to make sure that we're doing something that's not getting too fiddly. Obviously, when those programs were implemented, particularly JobKeeper, it was done so to make sure that we could get it out and get it out quickly. Obviously, when you find things are wrong with it, when there are gaps, you've got to adapt to that. The question is, how quickly can we adapt, and how will we make sure that we cover people for the time that's necessary to cover them? Probably better if as long as they are covered by one of those systems, then obviously that's better than.
Just finally and very briefly, the government predicts 850,000 jobs can be brought back on in the next couple of months. Do you think they can?
No, experience would suggest that is just not right. It takes a lot of time for businesses to get back up and running, and there'll be many businesses who are allowed to be running, but for whom it won't be profitable yet. So this will be a very slow and steady. We know unemployment's not going to peak for a couple more months at least, and then it will be a gradual downturn. So that's very optimistic in my view. I do hope I'm wrong, though.
Yeah, look, we all hope you're wrong. I've never hoped someone's wrong more, to be honest. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Deloitte Access Economics partner Nikki Hutley, who has challenged that figure, 850,000 jobs being able to be back online. Now, some breaking news this hour. The AFL has handed down heavy sanctions to the Adelaide Crows for an unauthorised training session in breach of physical distancing guidelines. We're going to have more on that story up next. Stay with us here on ABC News for that story, that breaking news. The breach already of those physical distancing rules as the AFL deliberates its return and all of the way that will look. Stay with us on the ABC News channel for more news. I'm Patricia Karvelas. I'll be back with afternoon briefing at 4 o'clock tomorrow. Catch you then.